Hi, I'm Sravish. This is Trust Talks, a series celebrating people and companies that make GRC trusted, accountable, and transparent. Today, I have with me Earl Duby, CISO at Auxiom, who I believe is one of the most committed practitioners in the security and privacy world. Earl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sravish. This is quite an opportunity. So thank you.
Earl, to kick things off, one of the things that you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago was why is security and privacy so darn expensive? And how do we make it affordable so that everybody can practice it with the highest standards? I'd love to hear your take on what do you think we should do to make this industry much more affordable and democratized for everybody?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a mission that I'm on right now, and so maybe I'll give you a little bit of background on me, which will help you understand why I'm where I'm at right now. So I've been an enterprise security practitioner for a long time. I've worked in some of the largest companies in the country. I've worked for GE. I've worked for Lear Corporation, which is a $20 billion company. I've worked for Synchrony Financial, which is another Fortune 200 financial services company. So I've always worked in this enterprise space. And when you're an enterprise, especially in financial services, you have a very large budget to work with when it comes to security. But, especially my time at Lear when I was working with GM and Ford and Stellantis, and we were trying to figure out how do we secure the supply chain, it became very clear to us that once you get below, like Lear was a tier one auto supplier, once you get below that tier one level and you start looking at these smaller and mid-sized companies, security isn't, you know, as readily available there because the budgets aren't really there and even the skill set isn't there. And so we really started to, run into this challenge of how do you defend the top end of the supply chain when there's all this vulnerability at the tail end of the supply chain. And so when I was at Lear, we worked together. So it was me, the CISO for GM, the CISO for Ford, and the CISO for Stellantis, and we were putting together ideas about how do we help push this security down the supply chain, or even how do we even raise awareness that there's a security problem that they need to be addressing, because a lot of it is they don't even know what the risk is because they don't have that person on board that's telling them about those risks, and they're just you know worried about other problems that are more operational. And so we got together, we put together a supplier awareness day, and we put on, my time at Lear, we put on like three of these every October, and it was a free day of virtual training, and we invited thousands of suppliers for those four automotive companies to this event, and we got a pretty good turnout of people that were willing to come to the table and learn about the risk, and then what are some cost effective ways of dealing with that risk. And so that, to answer your question, so that's kind of a long way to get to your question of, how do we start to make this more affordable to the smaller businesses that are in our supply chains, because every supply chain has them, and we need to do a better job of doing this. And I think there's a couple ways of, a couple tools in the toolbox that we have to kind of dig into here. One is we got to set requirements. So one of the things that I do see happening more and more, and I'm actually happy to see it, is through the third party risk assessment processes that a lot of these bigger companies are doing. They're pushing those requirements further down to their third and fourth party suppliers, and that's raising that awareness, and it's kind of upping the game for some of those mid-sized companies. So that sets up the awareness piece, but that doesn't address the affordability piece. So the affordability piece is really, I think, where the challenge is at for the entire community of how do we spread resources around so that we can get the right tooling to the people that need it. And I think, this is really where, some hard lines are going to have to get drawn here about, it's almost like a security welfare system or something along those lines, where you have to say, like, if I'm the top of the supply chain, so whether you're the OEM of an automotive, supply chain, or you're, the General Mills or the Kellogg's of the food chain or whatever, there's a risk there that you may have to compensate for. And I don't know how this is going to work, so this is just ideas being thrown around at this point, but somehow we're going to have to get to this point of saying there's value to the top of that supply chain for there to be security at the tail end of that supply chain. So how do you do that? Do you develop a consortium and, have multiple companies fund it and allow, companies further down the supply chain to draw from that? Or do and I know GM did this when I was at Lear, is they signed up for a third party risk assessment tool. I think it was maybe it was, can't remember the name of it, but it's one of those third party tools that look at your external posture and let you know if you have, open ports and things like that. And they bought an enterprise license to that tool set, and then modified the agreement to the point where they could offer it to their suppliers. So then I could use the GM licensing model to get that tool. And so maybe that's something that we have to think about, when you look at the, the Fortune 150 companies, of maybe they start buying licenses and providing some of that access to their suppliers so that we can make some of that cheaper further down there. And then the third leg to that stool to me is just the skill training. And again, this is where I think that the bigger companies have something to offer to the smaller companies, of saying, hey, look, if you have a security practitioner, maybe there's just one in your organization, and maybe they're feeling a little overwhelmed, or they're feeling a little bit under trained, let them go do some mentoring with, skilled people from these other companies. So maybe GM offers to, one of those smaller tier 2 or tier 3 type suppliers to have like virtual mentoring sessions or virtual training sessions with those people so that they can learn those skill sets. So I think, if we address the requirements, we make the tooling more affordable, and we start spreading that training around, free training, we can start to, push those talents and those skills further down the supply chain, which ultimately helps out the entire community that's involved.
Yeah, I think that's amazing innovation that you're talking about, Earl, because as you were speaking, one of the things that I remembered was Amazon Web Services, and so does Azure and GCP. They actually go to their startups that use their cloud products, and they offer free services such as foundational technical reviews and security reviews, where they pay for an external consultant to come in and look at your architecture on these clouds and tell you if there are any gaps in how you've implemented your product to use these clouds. And I think there's an opportunity to create a business model where buyers of software can provide access to consultants like this, who can come and do a security review and an architecture review, not from the perspective of telling you where all your gaps are, but rather from the perspective of helping you get better.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can operationalize that and make that more affordable and create a business model around it, then it helps the whole community at large.
Yeah, well, I like what AWS is doing, and Azure does it as well. Is, there's a ton of free content out there that they make available in terms of, security training, architectural training, uh, feature training. So there's a lot out there that they provide for free. And I've actually gone through some of the AWS training, and that's valuable training, because a lot of the risk that comes further down the supply chain is coming from cloud. It's a cloud risk that they're taking on, because they're migrating off-prem into a cloud service, software as a service and things like that, and they don't have the skill set to necessarily configure that stuff correctly, which then exposes all that data, those secrets, to adversaries. And that's where, when you think about like Ford or GM, and that's just kind of the frame that I look at a lot of things because I spent so much time in automotive. But when you look at those OEMs, they're sharing a lot of data with their suppliers. That's how you get a third party piece that fits into a Ford Ranger, is they have to share those specs, way down that supply chain to make that stuff work. And so there's a lot of secrets that are setting in these smaller companies. And in a lot of cases, they may understand that they have that risk, that they're holding onto that data, but they may not understand what the attack vectors are to that data, meaning they might not understand that they have a cloud, security gap that is exposing that data. And so, when you look at those free services from AWS, and if you can start to wrap around, more awareness, which is another, I'm involved with the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm the Detroit chapter president of the Cloud Security Alliance. And part of what we're trying to do is to raise the level of awareness with executives that just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean that you've mitigated your risk. You've just changed your risk. So now maybe instead of having the risk of a unpatched server in a unprotected storage room in your facility, now you've moved that risk up to the cloud, and you don't offload all that risk when you go to the cloud. You exchange some risk for other risk. And part of that is, do you have a skilled workforce that understands how to properly configure those cloud resources? And so, having those free resources out there and raising that awareness is pretty critical when you start making these digital transformations.
Earl, you mentioned about communicating your security posture with executives. What would be your practical advice for other CISOs or people that are growing in their careers on how to communicate the impact of their security investments to the executive teams as well as to the board of directors?
Well, I think to me, the problem isn't so much how CISOs are communicating to their executives. What I'm really focused on, and why I'm at Auxiom, so Auxiom is an MSP. And so, there's a couple things that I'm trying to do by joining an MSP. One is I want to dispel this myth that if you're a CISO at an MSP, you're not a CISO, you're a salesperson, which is totally not true. You're a CISO and a salesperson. You still have to protect all of your clients and your own company from all the same risks that any other CISO is protecting their client from. Now instead of having, a client with one logo over top of it, I have multiple clients with multiple logos, multiple different security postures, multiple different maturity levels. And so the challenge is actually more difficult to be a CISO at an MSP than what people really give it credit to. So I have to constantly be kind of dispelling this myth that now all of a sudden I'm a salesperson and not a security practitioner, which is incorrect. So so that's thing number one. Thing number two is, as a CISO at a MSP, the challenge becomes, how do you take people that have maybe never even thought about security and ease them into the concept of this risk that they're setting on that they may not even be aware of? Because typically when you're part of an MSP, you're not out directly interacting with the CEOs of these companies. That's being brought in through your other services that are being provided to them, whether it's infrastructure support or network support. And then we're offering this additional security service on top of that. So, I spend a lot of time talking to CEOs and managing partners of companies that have never really had to think about the security risk. And now we're presenting that to them. And so, you really have to go back to a very basic level of, what is this risk and why is it important to you? So I think to answer your question, when you have a CISO, you already have a company that is aware that they have a security problem. They wouldn't have a CISO if they weren't aware of the risk. So when you have the title CISO, you already know that you're working within a company that has some level of maturity. Now, they might not appreciate the full level of their risk, or they might not appreciate the full extent of what has to be done to mitigate that risk, but they at least understand and they at least have some governing body over top of them, whether it's a board of directors or whatever, that says, hey, this security thing is important and we have to do something about it. When you get into a company that doesn't have a CISO, that's where the communication is, much more important, because now you have to take them from, at some point, maybe zero to wherever they're at, and you gotta meet them where they're at and then try to guide them through there without that that lexicon being there, that all the things that are there when you have the structure in place that a CISO is working with.
And how do you one of the challenges CISOs have, Earl, is that they're always inundated with tons of security products. Have you encountered any security product or privacy related product in the recent past that you've looked at and said, wow, that's really innovative? That product is doing something interesting, special, unique, and is truly helping the industry in a big way?
Yeah, I know it's probably like an overplayed thing, but when CrowdStrike came along, you know that to me that was a bit of a game changer, because up until that point we had been dealing with endpoint protection that was very signature based and very database heavy, and the clients just kept growing and growing as you started putting all that historical data in there. And then CrowdStrike comes along and says, hey, look, we're going to keep everything up in the cloud so that we can keep a very light footprint on the devices, and we're not looking for signatures anymore, we're looking for behaviors. you know that that was awesome. And so when we switched off of our old antivirus product onto CrowdStrike, and then just saw the amount of things that it was finding that our previous product was setting on for years and didn't find, it was pretty eye-opening to see how that actually worked and see it in action like that. So that's probably the product that I'm most amazed with at the time that we made that transition. And I'm still amazed with it even years later, that that really has transformed the way that endpoint worked. Now we have other companies coming along that are mimicking that behavior based model. But I think as you see this infusion of artificial intelligence and machine learning into these security products, it really makes you see this divide between the old school, which was really just heavily based on reactive mode, versus now you can get to this point of being proactive and isolating individual nodes off and not having to shut entire VLANs down and things like that. I think it's really changed the way that blue teaming kind of works now, because they have a much better tool set.
Yeah, one of the things I always hear from CISOs is that don't just tell me where the smoke alarms are going off, tell me where the fire is that I need to work on right now. And that allows them to be more proactive and focus on
Yeah.
the more important things versus just being reactive every time a smoke alarm goes off because the battery is weak and needs to be changed.
Yeah, exactly. And on another set of products, I'm spending a lot more time now doing assessments and things like that that didn't used to happen before. Because, like was talking about a little bit earlier, when you're trying to explain this world of security and privacy to people that really aren't trained in that line of thinking, and so you're really starting from zero and trying to work that maturity level up, you really rely a lot more heavily on assessments and things like that to kind of tell the story. And so when you're trying to do that, in the old days, you would take a spreadsheet and you would say like, hey, here's the NIST cybersecurity framework, or here's the CIS 20, now the 18, and you would just start filling in this spreadsheet, and you would show people like, hey, look, this spreadsheet, you have all these gaps and things like that. Now with these new tools that are out there around GRC, it becomes much easier, and it's interesting to watch this world evolve, because like we're right in the middle of the evolution of these GRC tools when it comes to assessments. And I'm pretty amazed at how they don't just track your answers so that you can reuse some of the controls across multiple frameworks. They're actually hooking into your systems so that it's pulling your password policies right from the source system, as opposed to someone having to log in, take screenshots of the console and things like that and upload that as evidence. It's like, no, you're actually pulling this evidence directly from the source systems, putting that into a database, and then allowing multiple frameworks to reference that evidence as proof of compliance. And so I think that's also going to be a game changer as we move ahead, so that we can just speed up the process of assessing where our gaps are at, and then reducing the cost. If you're going for multiple certifications, you want to get an ISO certification, you want to get a SOC 2 certification, instead of collecting evidence twice, you can just collect the evidence once, put it into a database, overlay the frameworks, and then you can see where there's multiple controls that have been answered, and then you only have to focus on the things that are outside of that. That's going to be a tremendous workload relief for usually the one person in some of these organizations that have to go do all that work.
Earl, one of the things you've told me you're very passionate about is mentoring. You help lots of people in the community improve their skill set. Who has inspired you as somebody who gives back, somebody who's innovating, somebody who's a custodian of trust and is trying to elevate this practice of security, privacy, and GRC into more a trust-based mechanism? Who is a trust champion in your mind?
Yeah, so when I first took over the role at Lear, so I was coming from Synchrony Financial, and I was taking over the role at Lear, and I was the head of security at Lear. It wasn't a CISO at that point. It was a it was a senior manager of information security. And so I was looking around the community, and I ran into these two guys that have kind of shaped the way that I do the work that I do, and they really helped me on this journey of progressing from the senior manager of information security into the director of information security, and then ultimately to the VP and CISO at Lear before I left there. And those two guys, one was John Bingham. He was the CISO at Stellantis, and the other was Martin Bally, who was the CISO at ZF at the time, and then he shortly thereafter went to Diebold. So those two guys kind of took me under their wing, and were explaining to me like, here's how you got to elevate the conversation, here's how you have to build teams out, here's the types of things that you have to do to move this position from a senior manager position, which is really a practitioner type of a position, to a CISO, which is more of an executive level position. And so those two guys, they really helped me out, and showed me a lot of the ropes that I needed, and ultimately helped me grow that position to where it needed to be.
Martin, John, if you're hearing this, thank you so much for taking Earl under your wing, and he's now giving back and paying it forward with the next generation of security professionals, which is fantastic to see.
Yeah, I owe a lot to those guys, and I still talk to them regularly.
Earl, thank you so much for joining me today on Trust Talks. I really appreciate your help, and the community thanks you for everything that you're doing, not only in the greater Detroit area, but for the security community at large. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, and like you said, I like to give back, and I think we all should like to give back because, when you go down the path, the people behind us are the ones that are going to be protecting us in the future. So, we got to give them a good, solid foundation, a good ethical foundation. And that only happens if people reach out and give their time to the next generation of leaders that are coming up behind them.
Thank you, Earl.
All right, thanks.